It's 3:17 a.m. and here you are again. Not because you chose to be awake, but because something inside you refuses to rest. Tonight we're going to talk about the part of you that emerges when the world goes quiet. The shadow that feeds on your sleepless hours, whispering truths you've been avoiding since you learned to wear a mask. We're diving into dangerous territory tonight. The unconscious patterns that keep you awake, the projection mechanisms that turn your bedroom into a courtroom, and that peculiar form of self-sabotage where you punish yourself for crimes you didn't even know you committed. Think of this as therapy for people who've outgrown the need to pretend they're fine, but haven't quite figured out how to be honest about the mess underneath. Your ego just rolled its eyes, didn't it? That's how you know we're heading in the right direction. The part of you that's tired of surface-level healing, tired of spiritual bypassing, tired of collecting insights like trophies while your emotional basement floods. That part is paying attention now. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, united by insomnia and the strange comfort of confronting our psychological shadows in the dark. Lower the volume, adjust your position, and prepare to meet the version of yourself that only comes out when no one's watching. We're no longer in your bedroom. We're inside the mind of someone who's realized that sleep isn't just rest, it's surrender. And surrender requires trust you're not sure you have anymore. The good news, your shadow has been waiting patiently for this conversation. The bad news, it brought receipts from every emotional transaction you've been avoiding since 2019. This video is for those of you who are exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually tired of carrying wounds that have become so familiar they feel like personality traits. For those who lie awake not because of caffeine, but because your mind has become a 24-hour news channel, broadcasting every unresolved conflict from the last decade. For those who've discovered that healing isn't a destination, it's more like emotional archaeology, and sometimes you dig up things that make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. If you're here because you've tried meditation, therapy, journaling, sage cleansing, and that expensive course on manifestation, yet you still feel like you're performing your own life rather than living it, this is your space. Tonight we're going beyond the spiritual band-aids and into the uncomfortable truth about why your psyche won't let you rest. Carl Jung once observed that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. He wasn't talking about self-love in the Instagram sense. He was talking about the profound terror of meeting every part of yourself without the comfortable buffer of denial. That terror, that resistance to complete self-acceptance, is what keeps you awake at 3 a.m. Your mind isn't racing because it's overactive. It's racing because it's trying to outrun something that lives inside you. The shadow, Jung's term for the parts of ourselves we've rejected, hidden, or refused to acknowledge, doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It doesn't dissolve through positive thinking or get healed through weekend workshops. The shadow feeds on neglect. It grows stronger in the dark spaces of our consciousness, and it has a particular fondness for the quiet hours when our defenses are down and our distractions are asleep. You know that feeling when you're almost asleep, and suddenly your mind serves up that conversation from 6 months ago where you said exactly the wrong thing, or that moment of shame from childhood that somehow feels as fresh as if it happened yesterday. That's not random. That's your shadow trying to get your attention, using the only language it knows, the language of discomfort. Most people think the shadow is evil, dark, or dangerous. This is a fundamental misunderstanding that keeps us locked in an exhausting war with ourselves. The shadow isn't your enemy. It's the repository of everything you've had to reject in order to be acceptable, lovable, or safe. It contains not just your negative traits, but also your disowned power, your unexpressed creativity, your authentic anger, and your capacity for wild, uncompromising truth. Every time you've bitten your tongue instead of speaking up, every time you've smiled when you wanted to scream, every time you've diminished yourself to make others comfortable, those moments create shadow material. The energy doesn't disappear. It gets stored in the unconscious, where it ferments into the very anxiety and restlessness that keeps you awake. Think of your mind at 3 a.m. as a courtroom where all the witnesses you've silenced finally get to testify. The prosecutor is that part of you that judges every choice you've made, and the defense attorney is the part that's exhausted from making excuses for why you've betrayed yourself so many times. The jury is your own consciousness, and the verdict is always the same: guilty of not being true to yourself. But here's what they don't tell you in therapy. The goal isn't to silence this internal courtroom or to win the case. The goal is to realize that you've been playing every role: judge, jury, prosecutor, defendant, and witness. You're not the victim of your own mind's relentless judgment. You're the entire justice system that's been convicting yourself for crimes that aren't even illegal. The reason you can't sleep isn't because you've done terrible things. It's because you've abandoned yourself so thoroughly that your own psyche has become foreign territory. You've spent so much energy maintaining an image, meeting expectations, and avoiding conflict that you've lost touch with the person who actually lives inside your body. This disconnection from your authentic self creates what I call existential insomnia, sleeplessness that stems not from external stressors, but from the internal tension of living in opposition to your own nature. Your body is trying to rest, but your spirit is in active rebellion against the life you've constructed. The result is a mind that won't shut off because it's constantly trying to reconcile the person you pretend to be with the person you actually are. Let's talk about projection for a moment, one of the most exhausting ways we avoid meeting our shadow. When you're lying awake at 3 a.m., replaying every interaction from the day, your mind isn't just reviewing events, it's frantically trying to maintain the illusion that your emotional reactions are caused by other people's behavior rather than by your own unprocessed material. That person who made you angry, they didn't make you anything. They triggered something that was already inside you waiting to be activated. That colleague who always interrupts you, they're not the source of your frustration. They're the mirror reflecting your own relationship with power and voice. The family member who never listens, they're showing you how you've learned to abandon yourself in relationships. This isn't about blame or self-criticism. It's about reclaiming your power from the exhausting habit of making other people responsible for your internal state. Every time you make someone else the cause of your emotional experience, you give away a piece of your sovereignty. And your shadow, that wise, disowned part of you, knows this. It keeps you awake because it's trying to return that sovereignty to its rightful owner, you. The 3 a.m. mind is particularly skilled at what psychologists call emotional time travel. You're not just lying in bed, you're simultaneously reliving every moment you didn't stand up for yourself, anticipating every future scenario where you might be rejected, and comparing your inner experience to everyone else's highlight reel. Your mind becomes a time machine stuck in a loop between regret and anxiety, unable to land in the present moment where actual rest is possible. This temporal displacement is another shadow phenomenon. When we refuse to fully inhabit our present moment, to experience with all its imperfections, uncertainties, and uncomfortable truths, we scatter our consciousness across time. We send part of ourselves into the past to fix what can't be changed, and part into the future to control what hasn't happened yet. What remains in the present is a fragmented, anxious awareness that can't settle into the peace that comes from being fully here, fully now, fully yourself. Consider how your 3 a.m. mind constructs elaborate scenarios where you finally say the perfect thing to that person who hurt you 5 years ago, or how it rehearses conversations that will probably never happen, practicing responses to criticisms that exist only in your imagination. This isn't just worry. It's your psyche's attempt to rewrite history and control the future, because the present moment feels too uncertain, too vulnerable, too real. The shadow material that surfaces during these nocturnal projections often reveals the parts of yourself you've been most afraid to claim. When you're mentally arguing with your mother about boundaries she crossed decades ago, you're not just processing old hurt. You're practicing the assertiveness you've never allowed yourself to express. When you're imagining telling your boss exactly what you think of their management style, you're rehearsing the authority you've been afraid to embody. These mental rehearsals aren't pathological. They're your psyche's way of trying out different versions of yourself, experimenting with ways of being that include more of your authentic power. The tragedy is that most people dismiss these inner scenarios as useless worry when they're actually roadmaps toward greater wholeness. Your shadow contains not just your pain, but your power. Every time you've made yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were too narrow for your soul, you've deposited pieces of your authentic power into the shadow. Every time you've chosen safety over truth, comfort over growth, approval over integrity, you've fed your shadow with the very energy you need to feel alive and whole. The tragic irony is that most of us are afraid of our shadow because we think it contains our capacity for harm, when in reality, it contains our capacity for wholeness. We're not afraid of our darkness. We're afraid of our light. We're not afraid of being evil. We're afraid of being powerful. We're not afraid of hurting others. We're afraid of disappointing them by becoming too much ourselves. This fear of our own magnitude creates what Jung called the unlived life, the experience of constantly sensing that there's more to you than what you're expressing, more power than what you're claiming, more truth than what you're speaking. The unlived life creates a particular form of suffering that manifests as chronic dissatisfaction, inexplicable sadness, and yes, insomnia. Your soul won't let you rest because you're not letting it live. At 3 a.m. when the world is quiet and your defenses are down, the unlived life speaks loudest. It whispers questions that daylight consciousness finds too threatening. What would happen if you stopped pretending? What would your life look like if you honored your authentic desires instead of your learned obligations? Who would you become if you stopped being afraid of your own intensity? These questions are uncomfortable because they point toward changes that feel impossible or terrifying. They suggest that the life you've built, the relationships you've maintained, the career you've chosen, all of it might need to be examined and possibly transformed in service of becoming who you actually are rather than who you've learned to be. The shadow doesn't ask these questions to torment you. It asks them because it's the guardian of your authenticity, the part of you that refuses to let you sleepwalk through your own existence. It keeps you awake because it's trying to wake you up, not just from sleep, but from the trance of living someone else's version of your life. Consider the person you are at 3 a.m. when no one can see you, when you don't have to perform any role or meet any expectation. In those unguarded moments, what thoughts arise? What desires surface? What truths do you admit to yourself that you'd never say out loud? That 3 a.m. version of yourself isn't your pathology. It's often the most honest version of who you are. But we've been conditioned to see this nighttime authenticity as something to overcome rather than something to integrate. We pathologize the parts of ourselves that emerge in solitude and darkness, treating them as symptoms to eliminate rather than aspects of our nature to understand and incorporate into our daylight lives. Let's explore the relationship between shadow work and what you might call spiritual bypassing, the tendency to use spiritual concepts to avoid psychological work. Many people who are drawn to personal development and spiritual growth have a complicated relationship with their shadow because they've learned to see negative emotions and traits as obstacles to overcome, rather than information to integrate. You've probably encountered the teaching that you create your reality or you attract what you focus on. While these concepts contain truth, they're often misused as weapons against the shadow. When you're struggling with depression, anxiety, or any form of emotional pain, well-meaning people might suggest that you're choosing these experiences or attracting them through negative thinking. This approach turns spiritual principles into forms of self-violence. Instead of meeting your pain with curiosity and compassion, you're taught to see it as evidence of your failure to properly apply spiritual laws. Your shadow material, your anger, your sadness, your fear, becomes something to eliminate rather than something to understand. But here's what the 3 a.m. mind knows that your daylight consciousness often forgets. Your so-called negative emotions are not obstacles to your spiritual growth. They are the raw material of your spiritual growth. Your anger might be pointing toward values that are being violated. Your sadness might be grieving dreams that have been abandoned. Your fear might be protecting parts of you that feel too vulnerable to risk exposure. When you try to bypass these emotions through positive thinking, affirmations, or spiritual practices that emphasize transcendence over integration, you're essentially asking your shadow to go away. And shadows don't go away. They go underground, where they influence your behavior in ways you can't see or control. They leak out in passive-aggressive comments, self-sabotaging choices, and mysterious physical symptoms. They keep you awake, at night, whispering about all the ways you're failing to live authentically. The alternative to spiritual bypassing is what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. This means learning to be simultaneously aware of your light and your darkness, your strength and your vulnerability, your wisdom and your confusion. It means developing the capacity to hold space for contradictory truths about yourself without needing to resolve them into a neat, consistent narrative. At 3 a.m., when your mind is cycling through every mistake you've made and every fear you harbor, you're actually being invited into this practice of holding tension. Instead of trying to think your way out of discomfort or distract yourself back to sleep, you can experiment with simply being present with whatever is arising. Not fixing it, not analyzing it, not even understanding it, just being with it. This presence with your own experience, especially the uncomfortable parts, is the beginning of shadow integration. You're not trying to get rid of anything. You're trying to get to know everything. You're not trying to solve yourself, you're trying to meet yourself. You're not trying to become someone better. You're trying to become someone whole. Consider how different your 3 a.m. experience might be if, instead of judging your sleeplessness as a problem, you approached it as a sacred vigil, a time when your soul is doing important work that can only happen in the quiet darkness. What if your anxiety isn't evidence of your spiritual failure, but a sign that parts of you are ready to be heard, seen, and integrated? This doesn't mean romanticizing, suffering, or avoiding practical solutions when they're needed. It means approaching your difficulties with the understanding that they might be messengers rather than just obstacles, that your symptoms might be carrying information rather than just creating problems. The process of shadow integration often begins with what feels like falling apart. As you stop expending energy to maintain your persona, the socially acceptable mask you wear, you might experience what looks like regression. Old emotions surface, buried memories emerge. Patterns you thought you'd outgrown reassert themselves with surprising intensity. This isn't a sign that you're going backward. It's a sign that your psyche is finally safe enough to release what it's been holding. Your 3 a.m. wakefulness might actually be your unconscious mind's way of creating space for this material to surface when you're not busy performing your daily role. Many people panic during this phase of shadow work because they interpret the emergence of previously hidden material as evidence that they're getting worse. They might think, "I've been in therapy for years, I've done so much work on myself, and now I feel more anxious than ever. What's wrong with me?" What's wrong is the assumption that healing is supposed to feel good. What's wrong is the belief that psychological work should make you more comfortable rather than more authentic. What's wrong is the idea that you can integrate your shadow without experiencing some degree of chaos as the old structures that held your identity together begin to shift. Think of it this way. Imagine you've been living in a house for years, and you finally decide to clean out the basement. As you start moving boxes and opening old containers, dust gets stirred up. The air becomes harder to breathe. The space looks worse before it looks better. You might find things you forgot you had, things you wish you could forget again, and things you didn't know were there. This is what happens when you begin to excavate your psychological basement. The material that surfaces during shadow work isn't new, it's just newly visible. It's been influencing your behavior all along, but from the unconscious. Now it's in the light where you can actually work with it, but that doesn't mean it's comfortable. Your 3 a.m. mind often becomes the archaeological site where this excavation happens. Without the distractions of daily life, your consciousness has space to process material that's been waiting for attention. The sleeplessness isn't a symptom to eliminate. It's a sacred space where the work of integration can occur. But here's the crucial part. This work can't be rushed. You can't force integration any more than you can force a seed to grow by pulling on it. Shadow work operates on its own timeline, which is usually slower than your ego would prefer and more mysterious than your rational mind can track. This is why the 3 a.m. experience can be so frustrating for people who are used to being able to Solve problems through effort and analysis. You can't think your way into shadow integration. You can't strategize your way into wholeness. You can't optimize your way into authenticity. These processes require a different kind of intelligence, the intelligence of the body, the wisdom of dreams, the knowledge that comes through feeling rather than thinking. The emotions that surface during your sleepless hours aren't random. They're part of your psyche's natural healing process, like the body's immune response to infection. Just as physical healing sometimes requires inflammation and discomfort. As the body fights off what doesn't belong, psychological healing sometimes requires the surfacing of difficult emotions, as the psyche processes what needs to be integrated or released. Your job isn't to control this process or make it more comfortable. Your job is to learn how to be present with it, how to support it without interfering with it, how to trust your psyche's innate wisdom even when you don't understand its methods. This requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own emotional experience. Instead of seeing difficult emotions as problems to solve, you begin to see them as information to receive. Instead of trying to get rid of discomfort, you start getting curious about what it might be trying to communicate. Instead of judging your emotional reactions as inappropriate or excessive, you begin to honor them as valid responses to real experiences. For those who carry trauma, and that includes most of us, whether from obvious events or subtle patterns of invalidation and neglect, shadow work becomes more complex. Trauma creates what we might call protective shadows, aspects of ourselves that went underground, not because they were unacceptable, but because they were unsafe to express in the environments where we developed. If you grew up in a household where anger was dangerous, your healthy aggression might be locked in your shadow. If you were raised in an environment where emotions were dismissed or criticized, your natural sensitivity might be hiding there. If you learned that your needs were burdensome or your desires were selfish, those vital aspects of your humanity might be waiting in the unconscious for permission to re-emerge. Trauma-informed shadow work recognizes that some aspects of your shadow aren't just disowned. They're frozen in time, carrying the protective strategies that once kept you safe, but now keep you stuck. These parts of yourself might be afraid to come out of hiding because they remember a world where being seen was dangerous. Your 3 a.m. consciousness often becomes the space where these protective shadows feel safe enough to stir. In the darkness and solitude, away from any possibility of judgment or retaliation, they might risk making themselves known through memories, emotions, or physical sensations that seem to come from nowhere. Working with trauma-informed shadow material requires extraordinary gentleness and patience. These aren't aspects of yourself that can be forced into integration. They need to be invited, welcomed, reassured that the world has changed since they went into hiding. They need evidence that you're strong enough now to protect them, wise enough to understand them, and compassionate enough to hold them without judgment. This is why traditional approaches to shadow work, which often emphasize confronting and integrating disowned aspects through direct engagement, can sometimes re-traumatize people who carry protective shadows. The goal isn't to force buried material into consciousness, but to create enough safety and stability that it feels ready to emerge naturally. Your sleepless hours might be your traumatized part's way of testing whether it's safe to come out of hiding. They're not trying to torment you with anxiety or depression. They're trying to assess whether you've developed the resources to handle their emergence. The restlessness you feel might be their tentative movements toward the surface, like animals emerging from hibernation. This understanding can completely transform your relationship with your 3 a.m. experience. Instead of seeing your sleeplessness as a malfunction, you can begin to see it as a sign that healing is possible, that parts of yourself are ready to come home, that integration is beginning to happen at a pace that honors your psyche's need for safety. Your individual shadow doesn't exist in isolation. It's embedded within larger systems of collective shadows, the disowned aspects of families, communities, cultures, and humanity as a whole. Your personal 3 a.m. struggles often reflect not just your individual psychological material, but the broader patterns of disconnection and authenticity that characterize our time. We live in a culture that systematically creates shadow material through its emphasis on productivity over presence, image over authenticity, achievement over well-being. We are taught from early childhood to suppress parts of ourselves that don't serve economic systems or social stability. Our natural rhythms, our emotional complexity, our need for depth and meaning, all of these get relegated to the shadow in service of creating functional, productive members of society. Your insomnia might be your individual psyche's rebellion against collective values that don't serve your soul. When the culture tells you to be productive at all costs, your sleeplessness might be insisting on the value of rest and reflection. When society demands constant positivity, your 3 a.m. anxiety might be honoring the legitimate fears and concerns that positive thinking culture tries to suppress. This is why individual shadow work, while essential, isn't always sufficient for deep healing. Sometimes your personal symptoms are reflecting collective wounds that can't be healed through individual effort alone. Sometimes your 3 a.m. restlessness is your soul's response to living in systems that don't honor the full spectrum of human experience. Understanding this collective dimension of shadow work can be both relieving and overwhelming. Relieving because it means your struggles aren't entirely personal failures. They're often intelligent responses to dysfunctional systems. Overwhelming because it means healing involves not just personal integration, but participation in collective transformation. Your sleepless hours might be times when you're most aware of this collective dimension. At 3 a.m., when individual defenses are down, you might feel the weight of inherited trauma, cultural contradictions, and systemic violence that gets minimized or ignored during busy daylight hours. Your anxiety might be picking up on collective anxiety. Your depression might be responding to collective despair. Your restlessness might be feeling collective restlessness. This doesn't mean you're responsible for healing all of humanity's shadows, but it does mean that your individual healing happens within a larger context of collective healing, and that your personal integration contributes to the broader work of cultural transformation. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is honor your own rhythm in a culture that demands constant motion. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is feeling your feelings in a society that profits from emotional numbness. Sometimes the most healing thing you can do is be authentic in systems that reward performance. Your 3 a.m. wakefulness might be your participation in this larger healing process, your individual psyche's refusal to accept collective patterns that don't serve life, growth, and authenticity. Instead of seeing your sleeplessness as a personal failure, you might begin to see it as a form of sacred activism, a way of saying no to systems that don't honor the full depth and complexity of human experience. Shadow work isn't just a mental or emotional process, it's deeply embodied. Your body holds shadow material in its tissues, its tensions, its patterns of holding and releasing. The insomnia you experience at 3 a.m. isn't just happening in your mind, it's happening in your nervous system, your musculature, your cellular memory. Many people approach psychological work as if the body were just a vehicle for the mind, but the body is actually one of the most sophisticated instruments for shadow detection and integration. Your physical symptoms, your sleep patterns, your energy levels, all of these are constantly providing information about what's happening in your unconscious. When you can't sleep, your nervous system might be processing experiences that your conscious mind hasn't fully integrated. When you feel tension in your shoulders, your body might be holding anger that you haven't allowed yourself to feel. When you experience digestive issues, your gut might be rejecting life circumstances that don't align with your authentic nature. This is why purely mental approaches to shadow work often fall short. You can understand your patterns intellectually, you can analyze your triggers psychologically, but if you're not including your body in the integration process, you're missing essential information and resources for healing. Your 3 a.m. experience is deeply somatic. Notice what happens in your body when your mind starts racing. Does your heart rate increase? Do your muscles tense? Do you feel heat or cold? Does your breathing become shallow? These aren't just symptoms of anxiety. They're your body's way of processing and communicating about whatever your psyche is working through. Learning to work with your body during these sleepless hours can transform the experience from torture to transformation. Instead of lying in bed frustrated by your physical discomfort, you can begin to listen to what your body is trying to tell you. Instead of fighting the sensations, you can experiment with breathing into them, moving with them, or simply witnessing them with curiosity. Your body often knows things about your shadow that your mind hasn't figured out yet. It might tense up around certain people before you consciously recognize that they're not safe. It might feel expansive in situations that your mind judges as impractical. It might crave movement when your thoughts are stuck, or stillness when your emotions are overwhelming. This bodily intelligence is particularly accessible during the vulnerable hours of early morning, when your mental defenses are down and your physical awareness can come forward. Your 3 a.m. body might be your wisest teacher if you learn how to listen to its language of sensation, impulse, and energy. Working with the body in shadow integration often involves learning to tolerate intensity without immediately trying to discharge or escape it. Most of us have learned to manage difficult emotions by numbing, distracting, or thinking our way out of them. But the body processes emotion through feeling it, moving with it, breathing into it. Your sleepless hours might be times when your body is trying to complete emotional processes that got interrupted or suppressed. The restlessness you feel might be energy that wants to move. The tension might be emotions that want to be expressed. The fatigue might be your system's way of saying it needs rest from constantly managing unprocessed material. One of the most commonly disowned aspects of the shadow is creativity. Not just artistic expression, but the fundamental life force that wants to create, play, experiment, and bring new things into being. Many people have learned to suppress their creative impulses in favor of more practical, secure, or socially acceptable pursuits. This creative shadow often manifests as a persistent sense that you're not living your real life, that you're going through the motions of an existence that doesn't feel genuinely yours. It might show up as chronic boredom, inexplicable sadness, or a feeling that something essential is missing from your life even when everything looks good on paper. Your 3 a.m. consciousness often becomes the space where your creative shadow comes alive. In the quiet darkness, away from the demands and expectations of daily life, you might find your mind wandering toward projects you've never started, expressions you've never allowed yourself, ways of being that feel more alive than your current existence. These aren't just idle fantasies. They're communications from the part of you that knows who you really are beneath all the conditioning and compromise. They're invitations to reclaim aspects of yourself that got buried under practical considerations, other people's expectations, or your own fears of not being good enough. The creative shadow often carries tremendous energy, the life force that's been dammed up by years of choosing safety over expression, security over authenticity, approval over truth. When this energy starts to move, it can feel overwhelming, chaotic, or even dangerous. You might worry that if you start honoring your creative impulses, you'll make impractical choices that destabilize your life. But creativity doesn't require you to abandon responsibility or make dramatic life changes overnight. It requires you to start making space for the parts of yourself that want to create, play, and express, even in small ways. It requires you to stop judging your creative impulses as frivolous or self-indulgent and start seeing them as essential aspects of your psychological health. Your sleepless hours might be your creative shadow's way of demanding attention. Instead of lying in bed frustrated by your racing mind, you might experiment with getting up and engaging with whatever wants to be expressed. Write in a journal, sketch in a notebook, dance in your living room, sing in your shower. Not because you're trying to become an artist, but because you're trying to honor the parts of yourself that need creative expression to feel whole. Many people resist this kind of creative engagement because they've learned to judge their output, to worry about whether it's good enough, original enough, or valuable enough. But the creative shadow isn't concerned with producing masterpieces. It's concerned with the process of expression itself, with the aliveness that comes from allowing something to move through you without censoring or controlling it. This uncensored, creative expression often becomes a gateway to other shadow material. When you allow yourself to write without editing, to move without choreographing, to make sounds without judging, you often access emotions, memories, and insights that your conscious mind has been avoiding. Creativity becomes a form of active imagination, a way of dialoguing with your unconscious through symbol, metaphor, and embodied expression. Perhaps nowhere is shadow work more complex and necessary than in the realm of relationships. Your 3 a.m. mind often cycles through relational conflicts, replaying conversations, anticipating confrontations, and wrestling with the gap between how you want to love and how you actually behave in intimate connections. Every relationship becomes a mirror that reflects your shadow material back to you. The things that trigger you most intensely in others are usually aspects of yourself that you haven't fully owned or integrated. The patterns that repeat across multiple relationships often point to shadow dynamics that you're unconsciously recreating. But relationships don't just trigger your shadow, they also offer the possibility of healing it. When you're seen and accepted by another person, especially in your most vulnerable or difficult moments, something profound happens. The parts of yourself that have been hiding in shame or fear get to experience being witnessed without being rejected. Your 3 a.m. relationship anxieties often reflect deeper questions about your own lovability, worthiness, and capacity for authentic intimacy. When you're lying awake worrying about whether your partner really loves you, you're often actually wrestling with whether you really love yourself. When you're replaying arguments and planning what you should have said, you're often processing the gap between your authentic response and the one you thought was expected or safe. The shadow work of relationships involves learning to express your authentic self, even when it risks conflict, disappointment, or rejection. It involves saying the things you're afraid to say, asking for what you actually need, and setting boundaries that honor your real limits rather than the ones you think you should have. This is terrifying work because it requires risking the loss of relationships that might not be able to handle your full authenticity. But it's also liberating work because it allows you to discover which connections are strong enough to support your real self and which ones were built on performances that were never sustainable anyway. Your sleepless hours often become the space where you practice these more authentic ways of relating. You might rehearse conversations where you finally tell the truth about your feelings, your needs, your boundaries. You might imagine scenarios where you're more honest, more direct, more genuinely yourself. These mental rehearsals aren't just anxiety. They're your psyche's way of preparing for greater authenticity in your actual relationships. They're practice sessions for expressing parts of yourself that have been hiding in the relationship shadow. The shadow of love also includes the parts of loving that our culture teaches us to suppress: healthy selfishness, appropriate anger, the capacity to withdraw affection when it's not reciprocated, the willingness to prioritize your own well-being when relationships become toxic or draining. Many people have learned that love means endless giving, constant availability, and the suppression of any response that might be seen as selfish or demanding. This creates a shadow that contains all the ways you need to take care of yourself in relationships, the no's you need to say, the space you need to claim, the standards you need to maintain. When this relationship shadow remains unconscious, it leaks out in passive-aggressive behaviors, resentful compliance, or explosive conflicts that seem to come from nowhere. You might find yourself saying yes when you mean no, then feeling angry about the commitment you made. You might accommodate others to the point of self-abandonment, then wonder why your relationships feel inauthentic. Your 3 a.m. mind often cycles through these relationship patterns, replaying moments when you abandoned yourself for the sake of keeping peace, avoiding conflict, or maintaining connection. These aren't just regrets, they're your psyche's way of highlighting where integration is needed. In a culture that often equates human value with economic productivity, many people carry what we might call an economic shadow, disowned aspects of their relationship with money, work, and material security that get buried under practical considerations and survival fears. This economic shadow might contain your authentic relationship with abundance, your real values about work and leisure, your honest assessment of what constitutes enough, or your genuine desires about how you want to spend your life energy. It might also contain fears about scarcity, shame about your economic status, or anger about systemic inequalities that you've been taught to accept as normal. Your 3 a.m. consciousness often becomes the space where these economic shadows surface with particular intensity. When you're lying awake at 3 a.m., Your mind might cycle through financial anxieties, career dissatisfaction, or the persistent sense that you're trading your life energy for things that don't truly matter to you. This isn't just practical worry, it's often your soul's rebellion against economic arrangements that don't honor your authentic values or allow for the full expression of your humanity. Your sleeplessness might be your psyche's way of saying that something fundamental is out of alignment between how you're living and what you actually value. The economic shadow often contains not just fears about scarcity, but also discomfort with abundance, success, or having more than others. Many people have learned to feel guilty about prosperity, to downplay their achievements, or to sabotage their own success because having more feels selfish or dangerous in some way. This creates a complex relationship with manifestation and material well-being, where you might simultaneously crave security and feel uncomfortable with actually having it. Your 3 a.m. mind might cycle between fears of not having enough and fears of having too much, between anxiety about failure and anxiety about success. Working with the economic shadow often involves examining the stories you've inherited about money, work, and worth. Stories that might not actually reflect your authentic relationship with these realities. It involves questioning whether the economic arrangements you've accepted actually serve your well-being or whether they're based on conditioning that you never consciously chose. Your sleepless hours might be times when you allow yourself to imagine different economic realities, ways of living that prioritize your values over conventional measures of success, approaches to work that honor your creative nature rather than just your productivity, relationships with money that reflect abundance consciousness rather than scarcity fears. These aren't just fantasies. They're communications from the part of you that knows there are other ways to live, other ways to structure your relationship with material reality that might be more aligned with your authentic nature. Your 3 a.m. economics professor might be teaching you about values you didn't know you had. The spiritual shadow and authentic transcendence. For those drawn to spiritual growth and consciousness work, there's often a particular form of shadow that contains the parts of spiritual experience that don't fit the image of the evolved, enlightened, or awakened person. This spiritual shadow might include doubt, anger at spiritual teachers or communities, disappointment with the results of spiritual practice, or recognition that much of what passes for spirituality is actually sophisticated ego enhancement. Your 3 a.m. consciousness might be where your spiritual shadow feels safe to emerge, where you can admit to yourself that meditation sometimes makes you more agitated rather than peaceful, that you've used spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with practical realities, or that your spiritual community has its own forms of judgment and exclusion that feel just as painful as those in secular contexts. This spiritual shadow work isn't about abandoning spiritual practice or becoming cynical about transcendent possibilities. It's about developing a more honest, integrated relationship with spiritual growth that includes the messy, difficult, non-linear aspects of consciousness development that Instagram spirituality tends to ignore. The spiritual shadow often contains what we might call holy anger, appropriate rage at spiritual bypassing, guru abuse, commercialized enlightenment, or the ways that spiritual teachings get distorted to support systems of oppression rather than liberation. This anger isn't anti-spiritual. It's spiritually intelligent, capable of discerning between authentic transcendence and spiritual materialism. Your sleepless hours might be when this spiritual shadow comes alive, questioning teachings you've accepted without examination, recognizing patterns in spiritual communities that mirror the same unconsciousness they claim to transcend, or acknowledging that your spiritual practice has sometimes been a sophisticated form of self-improvement rather than genuine surrender. This recognition can be deeply disorienting because it challenges the spiritual identity you might have built around being someone who's done the work, who understands consciousness, who's evolved beyond the petty concerns that trouble less awakened people. But this disorientation is actually a gateway to more authentic spiritual development. True spiritual maturity often involves what we might call post-spiritual spirituality, a relationship with transcendence that's been seasoned by disappointment, refined by discrimination, and grounded in the recognition that consciousness development is far more complex and mysterious than most spiritual marketing would suggest. Your 3 a.m. spiritual shadow might be teaching you that real awakening includes rather than transcends your humanity. That genuine enlightenment is more about integration than escape, and that the most profound spiritual development often happens through engaging fully with ordinary life rather than trying to transcend it. The death shadow and life force. Perhaps the deepest layer of shadow work involves our relationship with mortality, endings, and the parts of life that involve loss, grief, and letting go. Most of us learn early to avoid thinking about death, aging, or the impermanence that characterizes all existence. This creates what we might call a death shadow, all the ways we relate to endings, transitions, and the reality that everything we love will eventually be lost. Your 3 a.m. consciousness often becomes the space where death anxiety surfaces, where you confront the reality of your own mortality and the mortality of everyone you love. This isn't morbid thinking. It's your psyche's attempt to integrate one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience that our culture systematically denies and avoids. The death shadow contains not just fear of dying, but also the life force that gets suppressed when we're unconsciously trying to avoid anything that reminds us of mortality. When we're afraid of endings, we often become afraid of beginnings. When we're terrified of loss, we often avoid deep attachment. When we're denying impermanence, we often fail to fully inhabit the present moment. Working with the death shadow often involves developing what Buddhists call death awareness, not obsessive worry about dying, but conscious recognition that mortality gives life its poignancy, urgency, and meaning. It involves allowing the reality of impermanence to inform your choices about how to spend your precious time and energy. Your sleepless hours might be times when your psyche is practicing this death awareness, confronting the reality that time is limited and asking whether you're spending it in ways that honor what you most deeply value. The anxiety you feel at 3 a.m. might not just be about immediate concerns. It might be your soul's recognition that life is short and you're not yet living it fully. This death work often involves grieving not just actual losses, but the ongoing losses that come with growing up, making choices, and accepting the reality that you can't live all possible lives. Every choice involves a kind of death, the death of other possibilities, other versions of yourself, other ways your life might have unfolded. Your 3 a.m. mind might be processing these developmental deaths, mourning the parts of yourself you've had to leave behind, the dreams you've had to abandon, the relationships that couldn't survive your growth. This grief isn't pathological, it's appropriate recognition of what it costs to become who you are. The death shadow also contains what we might call completion energy, the life force that wants to finish things, to bring closure to unfinished business, to say what needs to be said before it's too late. Your sleeplessness might be your psyche's way of creating space for this completion work, reviewing relationships and experiences to see what still needs attention, expression, or resolution. The political shadow and collective healing, your personal shadow work doesn't exist in isolation from the larger political and social context in which you live. The individual psychological material that surfaces at 3 a.m. often reflects broader patterns of collective trauma, systemic oppression, and cultural shadow that gets projected onto marginalized groups while remaining unconscious in dominant culture. This political dimension of shadow work involves recognizing how your personal healing connects to collective healing, how your individual integration contributes to broader social transformation. It involves examining the ways that personal symptoms might be intelligent responses to sick systems rather than individual pathology. Your 3 a.m. consciousness might be where you feel most acutely the gap between the world as it is and the world as it could be, where you confront the reality of suffering that exists beyond your personal experience, where you grapple with questions about responsibility, privilege, and your role in creating the kind of world you want to live in. This political shadow work isn't about taking on responsibility for everything that's wrong with the world. It's about recognizing the ways that personal and collective healing are interconnected, that individual shadow work contributes to the broader work of cultural transformation. Sometimes, your sleeplessness might be picking up on collective anxiety, cultural trauma, or the psychic weight of systemic violence that gets minimized or denied in mainstream discourse. Your sensitivity to suffering that extends beyond your personal experience isn't pathological. It's often a sign of expanded consciousness that's becoming aware of realities that others are still avoiding. Working with the political shadow often involves developing what we might call conscious citizenship, ways of engaging with collective challenges that honor both your individual limitations and your genuine capacity to contribute to positive change. It involves finding sustainable ways to care about the world without burning out from overwhelm or despair. Your 3 a.m. political professor might be teaching you about values you didn't know you had, showing you forms of suffering you hadn't fully acknowledged, or revealing ways that your personal healing connects to broader patterns of liberation and justice, integration practices for the 3 a.m. soul. So how do you actually work with all of this shadow material that surfaces during your sleepless hours? How do you transform 3 a.m. anxiety from torture into opportunity for integration and growth? The first principle is learning to approach your sleeplessness with curiosity rather than resistance. Instead of fighting your wakefulness or judging it as pathological, you can begin to see it as your psyche's way of creating space for important psychological work that can only happen when your defenses are down and your distractions are offline. This shift in perspective, from problem to opportunity, can completely transform your experience of insomnia. Instead of lying in bed frustrated that you can't sleep, you can become curious about what wants your attention, what parts of yourself are ready to emerge, what integration work your psyche is trying to accomplish. One practical approach is learning to dialogue with whatever emotions or thoughts arise during your sleepless hours. Instead of trying to suppress anxiety, you can ask it what it's trying to protect. Instead of fighting sadness, you can inquire about what it's grieving. Instead of judging anger, you can explore what values it's defending. This internal dialogue isn't about believing everything your emotions tell you or acting on every impulse that arises. It's about developing a more conscious relationship with your internal experience, treating your emotions as sources of information rather than just obstacles to overcome. Active imagination, Jung's technique for engaging with unconscious material, through visualization, dialogue, or creative expression, can be particularly powerful during 3 a.m. consciousness. You might imagine conversations with different aspects of yourself, visualize the people or situations that are causing you anxiety, or allow images and symbols to arise without trying to control or interpret them immediately. Writing can be another powerful tool for 3 a.m. shadow work. Stream of consciousness journaling, where you write without editing or censoring, often allows unconscious material to surface in ways that surprise you. You might find yourself expressing feelings you didn't know you had, accessing memories you'd forgotten, or discovering insights that weren't available to your rational mind. Movement and breathwork can also support shadow integration during sleepless hours. Instead of lying still and fighting your restlessness, you might experiment with gentle stretching, conscious breathing, or simple movement that honors whatever energy wants to move through your system. The key is learning to work with your 3 a.m. experience rather than against it, to see it as an opportunity for deeper self-knowledge rather than just an obstacle to rest. This doesn't mean staying awake all night or avoiding practical solutions for sleep difficulties. It means approaching your sleeplessness with the understanding that it might be serving important psychological functions. The wisdom of incomplete healing. One of the most important recognitions in shadow work is that some aspects of healing are ongoing processes rather than problems to be solved once and for all. The goal isn't to eliminate all psychological difficulty or to achieve some final state of integration where you never struggle again. The goal is to develop a more conscious, skillful relationship with your own complexity, to become large enough to contain contradictions, strong enough to hold difficulty without being overwhelmed, and wise enough to work with your psychological material rather than against it. This means accepting that you might always have certain vulnerabilities, that some patterns might never completely disappear, that integration is an ongoing process rather than a destination you reach. This acceptance isn't resignation, it's wisdom about how psychological development actually works. Your 3 a.m. struggles aren't evidence that you're failing at healing or that your spiritual practice isn't working. They're often signs that deeper layers of material are ready for attention, that your capacity for consciousness is expanding to include previously hidden aspects of your experience. Learning to see your ongoing psychological work as a feature, rather than a bug of being human, can bring tremendous relief. You don't have to become a perfect person to be a whole person. You don't have to solve all your problems to live authentically. You don't have to eliminate all suffering to experience profound meaning and connection. The community of 3 a.m. souls. As we come to the end of our journey together tonight, I want you to consider that you're not alone in this experience. Around the world, at this very moment, there are thousands of people lying awake at 3 a.m. wrestling with their own shadow material, confronting their own complexity, doing their own quiet work of integration. You're part of an invisible community of souls who are brave enough to meet themselves in the dark, patient enough to sit with difficulty, and wise enough to recognize that some of the most important psychological work happens in the liminal spaces between sleeping and waking. This community doesn't meet in any physical location, doesn't have membership cards or group meetings, but it's real nonetheless. A global network of people who are committed to consciousness, who are willing to do the difficult work of becoming whole, who understand that healing happens not through avoiding difficulty, but through learning to be present with it. Your 3 a.m. vigil is your contribution to this collective healing process. Every moment you spend in conscious dialogue with your shadow, every hour you practice staying present with discomfort, every sleepless night you meet with curiosity rather than resistance. All of this contributes to the broader work of human consciousness development. The shadow work you do in the privacy of your own bedroom has ripple effects that extend far beyond your individual healing. As you become more authentic, you give others permission to be authentic. As you integrate your disowned aspects, you stop projecting them onto others. As you heal your personal trauma, you contribute to the healing of collective trauma. This isn't spiritual bypassing or magical thinking. It's recognition of the basic reality that individual and collective healing are interconnected, that the consciousness work you do in solitude contributes to the evolution of consciousness in general. Your 3 a.m. restlessness isn't just personal pathology. It's your participation in the broader awakening that's happening as more people recognize that the old ways of being human aren't sustainable, that deeper integration is required, that consciousness development is no longer a luxury for a few seekers, but a necessity for anyone who wants to live authentically in these complex times. So tonight, if you find yourself awake at 3 a.m., remember that you're not alone. You're part of a global community of conscious souls who are committed to the patient work of integration, who understand that healing happens slowly and mysteriously, who are brave enough to meet their shadows with curiosity and compassion. The conversation you have with yourself in those quiet hours contributes to conversations happening in bedrooms around the world. The integration you achieve in your individual psyche contributes to integration happening in the collective psyche. The healing you do in the darkness contributes to the light that's emerging as more people wake up to who they really are, beneath all the conditioning and compromise. Your shadow isn't your enemy, it's your teacher, your healer, your guide back to wholeness. And your 3 a.m. wakefulness isn't your pathology, it's your practice, your training ground for consciousness, your ongoing education in the art of being fully human. The work isn't to eliminate the shadow or to sleep through every night without difficulty. The work is to develop an ongoing conscious relationship with all aspects of yourself, to become large enough to contain your own complexity and to contribute your unique piece to the larger puzzle of human awakening. Write in the comments, "I choose to meet my shadow with curiosity instead of fear." Let's see how many of you are ready for this kind of awakening, the kind that happens not in the light of day, but in the honest darkness of 3 a.m., when you finally stop running from yourself and start walking toward the person you've always been, underneath the masks. And tell me what aspect of your shadow feels ready for conscious exploration. What part of your 3 a.m. experience would you like to understand more deeply? Your suggestions will guide our future conversations, our continued exploration of the beautiful, terrible, necessary work of becoming whole. Remember, your 3 a.m. restlessness isn't a malfunction of your system. It's a feature, It's your psyche's way of creating space for the parts of you that have been waiting in the shadows, ready to transform your life from the inside out. The question isn't how to get rid of it. The question is how to work with it skillfully, how to listen to it wisely, how to let it teach you what it knows about the art of being fully, authentically, unapologetically human. Sweet dreams, whenever they finally come. And sweeter awakening to the parts of yourself you're finally ready to meet.